We're going up and down, over and over, over and over. It's the same old thing. Up and down, over and under.
All right. Well, Jonathan, welcome to the show. We're excited to talk to you today.
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So we were just talking about this a little bit. We were put in touch by George Church, which I'm honored that he even took the time to respond and think about what I was asking and put me in contact with someone who's doing something so cool as Fitbiomics. Biomics, am I saying it right?
Biomics, yeah.
Biomics, yeah. I was so intrigued when I learned about what you were doing that I immediately jumped at the opportunity to talk to you about it. I think, like I said earlier, such a cool confluence between, a biological process that I think we're learning more about culturally, at least those who are interested in health and wellness, and then an application of such an interesting technology to enhance your own performance by something that I think a lot of people didn't even realize they could necessarily impact. But before we get into that, I think what's also really interesting is you yourself were a high-level athlete.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I don't know. I guess it's debatable how high level. I mean, obviously I, became a scientist, and that was probably a function of me not being good enough to play professionally. So, I mean, but everything is relative, right? And I think, but you're right. I think a lot of what we're doing with Fitbiomics is a function of both my background and passion for athletics, but also sort of biotechnology and bridging these communities together.
Yeah. Well, and so you played basketball at St. John's, and not only just played, but you played during a time period when St. John's, was really good.
Yeah. I mean, so, I'm a New Yorker, and I'm a Big East kid. And, I grew up in New York. I went to school here, and I went to St. John's University, 99 to 03. And as you said, the Big East was tough back then. The Big East is always tough, but our St. John's team, we won the Big East championship my freshman year, and then we won the NIT my senior year. We had a lot of really good players, and I think New York traditionally is known for guard play, so we had a lot of really good guards. And as I always say, I wasn't good enough to make the league, so my backup was getting a PhD in biomedicine, and I got that at NYU. So again, continuing the New York roots, and then that only changed when I went to Boston and George's lab at Harvard to do my postdoc. So that was tough as a New Yorker going to Boston.
Oh yeah. Well, and how was that experience going up to Boston and getting to work at is it the Wyss lab? Am I saying that, or the Wyss Institute?
Yeah, the Wyss Institute for Biologically Inspired Engineering. And it's a special institute associated with Harvard and MIT that's really focused on translation, sort of, biologically inspired engineering, the notion of learning what works in nature and what has been selected from sort of a biological standpoint over billions of years, and then learning from those principles, decoding them, and then applying that to now create solutions that are beneficial for society in many regards, human health, environmental health, but really focused on taking research out of the lab and having real world impacts. And I think just telling this, you could probably get a sense of how that's influenced me and sort of the journey of Fitbiomics and how we're applying biotechnology and athletes and phenotypes to create next gen nutrition and health modalities.
Yeah. And so what kind of, led you down this path? So obviously, as you said, you're at the Wyss Institute. It's all about application, and you have the strong background in athletics. But what about the microbiome was interesting enough to you that you said, hey, this is a problem worth solving?
I just think we're in a really fascinating and interesting time and an inflection point for this field as a whole. So first and foremost, just like the genomics revolution, if you will, in synthetic biology, and you go back 2003, the first human genome sequence was published. That was an endeavor that took 15 years and $3 billion. We now have technology where we could sequence a human genome in 2 days for $1,000. And that rapid acceleration and basically decoding and discovery our entire environment around us. And for me, growing up, I was always into genotypes to phenotypes and understanding sort of the molecular codes that sort of determine every, organism and their functionality. And I was never into sort of, personal genomics per se, because I felt that was more limiting and deterministic. But if you think about the microbiome and how dynamic it is and how we could change it, how we could extract it, how we could optimize it and sort of turn those discoveries into actual nutrition and probiotics, to me, that was like the perfect intersection of decoding health, but then turning it into something that has a practical application. So that was a little bit long-winded, but I think
that's perfect. Yeah. And I guess maybe could we start too? And as I said, like if people listening to this one are like, oh, Ken's stumbling a little bit, it's because truly like, if I'm out of my depth, it's because I am. So could we even start just talking about, what is the microbiome?
Yeah. So the microbiome is essentially an ecosystem of trillions of microorganisms that live in and on our body, predominantly in our gut. I think microbiome has become popular and in vogue these days. It wasn't necessarily that way 10 years ago or even 5 years ago, but I think people are familiar with the term that we are as much bacteria as we are human. And that's actually true. We have trillions of microbial cells in our body, and an equal amount of microbial cells as human cells. So think about that for a second.
That I did not know, actually.
Yeah. So, and these microorganisms, they pretty much influence everything we do in daily lives. So obviously, if they're in our gut, they interface with our diet and what we eat. They break down foods into nutrients, better absorption, but they also interact with our immune system. Like 70% of our immune system is in our gut. They also produce metabolites, neurotransmitters. So anything you could think of from, health, energy metabolism, protein metabolism, neurology, immunology, our gut microbes are greatly influencing that.
Wow. Well, and so from there, like what are the sort of factors that contribute to the makeup of your microbiome? Like, is this something that your environment can impact? Is a lot of this determined by just like your own genetic profile?
So it's interesting. Your personal genetic profile probably least determines your microbiome composition, which is it's kind of interesting. A majority of it actually is determined by diet and what you eat. Also environment, geography, physical activity, in terms of diet, also like smoking, drinking, antibiotic usage. So there's so many things that impact your microbiome. And I'll just say, and this is maybe a transition to Fitbiomics work, predominantly in a biomedical background, a lot of times we look at diseased physiology and like what doesn't work in them and how can we correct that to promote health. But what Fitbiomics is doing is looking at super healthy individuals and phenotypes and what's uniquely enriched and selected for to support their physiology, learning from that and then translating that to help everyone.
Yeah. So maybe we do kind of spin off into that conversation. So, okay. So trillions of bacteria make up the human body. The microbiome, it sounds like, heavily influenced by, if I, stop me when I start getting any of this wrong, environmental factors, right? Which I think, to me, like that's always interesting because then what I hear is like, oh, I can impact this. Like I'm loving a lot of these longevity conversations that are happening right now. And something that is motivating is to hear that, again, like your actual genetic makeup actually is responsible for like a small percentage of how you age. A lot of the other things that, impact that are environmental in nature and things that you can, quote unquote, control. So when you kind of went down this path of trying to understand, hey, elite high performers, right? Professional athletes, what were you looking for and what were you trying to isolate in determining like what in their microbiome might be supporting their, maybe like superior level of performance?
Yeah, so I think a lot of this was influenced by some of the foundational studies in the field. Like I think not everyone, but a lot of people are familiar with the concept of, fecal transplants and how if you took, the gut composition of like an obese organism and you transplanted that into an animal, that mouse or animal would become obese, and vice versa. If you took that from like a lean individual and transplanted that animal or mouse would become lean. So the notion
is that true? Like, is that,
that's
been verified?
Yeah, there's been a
verified.
lot of,
wow.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of those have been done preclinically, so like in animal models as proof of principle concepts, and now they're trying to translate them into human clinical studies. But there are also other concepts too, like the notion of C. difficile, which is a pathogenic organism that affects around 500,000 individuals a year. It happens when you take antibiotics, it wipes out your gut, and this is an opportunistic organism that creates all sorts of issues with inflammation and colitis. You could cure that by 95% with transplanting a new microbiome into that patient, and it outcompetes this organism. So there was a lot of stuff in the field emerging, and then applies to diabetes and even sort of like neurological issues. But I think for me, we spoke about energy metabolism, protein metabolism, neurology, immunology. If you look at athletes, that turns into endurance, strength, mental toughness, recovery. So if you look at these super athletes, that the 0.0001% of the population, the thought was, well, let's see what bugs are driving their elite performance. And then can we identify them, decode them, purify them? And now you have probiotics that can benefit everyone in terms of daily lifestyles and health.
Wow. And then could we, and maybe we kind of talked about this a little bit, but could we talk about the ways that your microbiome influences some of those other, I guess I'm going to say like bodily functions? But like, can you talk about the systems that your microbiome has a direct impact on?
Yeah. So first and foremost, I think what are the bugs in our gut doing and stuff like that? These are all live organisms, and they also act in different communities synergistically and stuff. So first and foremost, they have metabolic pathways and enzymes that could help us break down foods, carbohydrates, fibers, proteins. And actually, a lot of what we eat, we don't necessarily break down. These bugs break them down. So that's the energy and protein metabolism component. They also have like molecular patterns on their surface that sort of cue our immune system that can help suppress inflammation. In some ways, if you have an overgrowth of bad bacteria, they could actually activate your immune system that could lead to like IBD or Crohn's or even like rheumatoid arthritis.
Oh, wow.
And then the other aspect too is, in terms of what you eat and production, that could also influence obesity, can influence diabetes, glucose levels. But then they also produce these interesting things like 95% of serotonin, a neurotransmitter, is produced in our gut. So a lot of the a lot of the metabolites these bugs produce act holistically in our body and even our brain. So this is like over the past couple of decades, science that is coming out and now is just starting to become mainstream and also translatable into practical applications.
Yeah. Okay. So moving forward, you decide rather, there's these super athletes, right? That 0.01% of the population. Let's see if we can determine, what is happening in their gut that's enabling them to perform, at a, I keep saying superior level. That's not necessarily what I mean, but, so what does that process look like to start to run that analysis? Did you actually go out and partner with like top high tier athletes? And were they collaborating along the way to like help inform this research?
Yeah. So I think you probably know this as well as most. I think athletes or high performance athletes are very, well, at least you hope, attuned to their body. And they're always looking for ways to optimize their biology, to maintain performance or recovery or training. So I think when you talk to athletes about the notion of their gut and how it impacts their health, first and foremost, it's surprising how many athletes say, yeah, you know what? I kind of noticed my gut impacts my performance on a daily basis, and I'd like to learn more. But yeah, when we were at Harvard, we did over 4 years of research. We recruited marathon runners, ultra marathon runners, rowers. Those communities are enriched in Boston. And then we sequenced their microbiomes, pre and post exercise, and we looked for things that changed in their gut and how also that compared to non-athletes. And we made a bunch of really exciting discoveries.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, and so then like, what is that next step? So when we talk about taking a probiotic, right, we've talked about this living bacteria that's in your gut. There's trillions of them. When someone takes a probiotic, we can start to talk about what you guys are doing at Fitbiomics. Is that supplement that they're taking also, quite literally, like, is that living bacteria that you are then like, insert into your own microbiome?
Yeah. I mean, the other thing you have to also consider is, again, we're as much bacteria as we are human, and a lot of what we consume, a lot of the foods we consume contain living microorganisms in them. Like, you think about sort of diets that are beneficial, like fermented foods and things of that nature, they naturally contain probiotics, yogurts, things of that nature. Even the notion of fibers being prebiotics that feed the bacteria in our gut, there are certain foods that are beneficial, but you're right. The definition of a probiotic is a microorganism that confers a functional benefit to the host. So they don't always have to be alive. They could have beneficial effects even if they're inert or dead, but a lot of times they are live microorganisms.
Wow. And so, in passing, people like you're casually reading about probiotics. It happens from time to time. It seems, that it's debatable the extent to which we can make a lasting change to our microbiome. Can you kind of talk about like what the research is saying today, and the extent that someone can make, a sustained impact on kind of like the current microbial environment?
Yeah, I mean, so first and foremost, I think there are definitely benefits in, certain patient populations, like we said, C. diff and fecal transplants and stuff. I think that continues to be sort of like, an example of how this field could really improve human health. But then, probiotics in general, a lot of times right now are associated with digestive health. So helping us break down foods better, helping us with bowel movements, reducing constipation, also just improving overall regularity, if you will. But I also think for a lot of athletes that maybe travel internationally, maybe have high endurance exercise, it has negative impacts on their GI. So the notion of bowel movements in and of itself is beneficial. But that's just that's one category of probiotics. I think what we're doing is now looking for other applications, like let's say improved quality of sleep through neurotransmitter production, improved recovery through reduction of, let's say, inflammation, or even improved endurance through, let's say, lactic acid metabolism. And some of these things are real, and we're already developing them with Fitbiomics and other sort of microbiome companies as well.
So maybe I was thinking about this the wrong way, because something you just said just kind of clicked for me. Is it not necessarily about like, hey, someone starts using Nella, and I would love to talk about Nella. They start, supplementing with these probiotics. It's not just rather that we're trying to make like a long-term change to their microbiome. It's that, hey, when you take these probiotics and you're looking to perform over like even a shorter window, you're going to have more of that bacteria in your gut that is going to enable you to, as you said, like better, improve metabolism, better endurance capabilities. Is that a better way to think about it?
Yeah. Obviously, our microbiome, there's a lot of organisms in there that have a foothold in there and tend to outcompete new probiotics we introduce. But to your point, even transiently, right? If you consume a probiotic on a daily basis, within a matter of, let's say, weeks or a month, you could have improved digestion, improved bowel movements, improved sleep, improved lactic acid metabolism. And these things over time could greatly impact our daily performance. Yeah. That's the other thing too. It's not so much about sports performance, it's about human performance. And how our gut could help us stay active and stay healthy and stay fit, which in turn has applications for everything else we want to do.
Yeah, I suppose it's helpful to remember that athletes are also people.
Exactly. Yeah. But they're also people, but I'll also just say too, like they're people that could use help, right? They're also a model for optimal health in many ways. So by understanding what works in them, it could help everyone. And I think that's part of the mantra and the mission for Fitbiomics, if you will.
Yeah. Could we talk a little bit about Nella specifically? I know that there's been a lot of, we were talking about this earlier, a lot of like exciting press around it, and rightfully so. Could we talk a little bit about who Nella is right for? And you may have just said like, hey, look, anyone who's looking to like improve the quality of life, it sounds like there's some benefit to be had. But this does seem to very much be oriented as like a performance enhancing company.
Yeah, I think our mantra, and something I'm fond of saying, and this is somewhat of a George Churchian, right? I think the notion of, we just spoke about biologically inspired engineering, form fits function. I like to say Fitbiomics is decoding and recoding human health through microbiome innovations. So it's like looking at what's enriched or working in super performers, translating that into modalities for everyone. Nella is our first innovation and product in this long discovery pipeline. And where we started with Nella is gut health. And for instance, if you look at probiotics in the market, they're decades old. They typically are isolated from food, baby poop, animals, or the environment. And again, if we're looking to help people stay active and fit, maybe a good place to start is look for improved probiotics that are naturally function in super fit people, right? That's form fits function. So Nella really is designed, they're all unique athlete-derived probiotics. They're lactobacillus species that are aimed for better digestion, bowel movements, and they're also supporting with improved quality of sleep. It's something we like to say is field tested. It's currently being used by Olympic champions, world champions, national champions. But to your point, it's helping a lot of people. It's helping, non-elite athletes, just health seekers or fitness enthusiasts that want to basically stay fit and stay active. So that's Nella. But again, I'm excited to say it's just the first of many innovations in the pipeline.
Oh, it's awesome. Well, and you've mentioned this a couple of times too, and anyone who listens to the show knows that I am laser focused on improving my sleep. Could we dive a little bit deeper as to how some of these probiotic supplements could actually enhance or improve the quality of your sleep?
Yeah. So I think there are direct ways and there are indirect ways. So one, probiotics could produce neurotransmitters that help us with brain functionality and optimization.
You mentioned serotonin and
GABA, things of that nature. So they could help relieve, let's say, anxiety, or they could help with, sleep. Then there are indirect ways, right? Like if you have better nutrition, better digestion, like there's also people that maybe have IBS symptoms and it affects their sleep. So if you're also correcting digestion and your GI health, that in turn will have an effect on sleep. And by the way, how all these things are related, you mentioned performance enhancing. I mean, sleep is like the number one performance enhancing drug, right? So think about this for a second. Like by improving your gut health, you can improve sleep, which in turn can help improve recovery and performance. So all these things are connected.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Well, and I don't know what you're allowed to share necessarily. So understanding, so for Fitbiomics, right, Nella is the first kind of entry into the market. What other spaces or opportunities does the team have its eye on?
Oh man, this is really exciting. So actually, we published a paper while in George's lab in Nature Medicine, and it was for a bacteria called Veillonella. So you can see the evolution, Nella, Veillonella. And Veillonella is a bug that we discovered in ultramarathon runners, and its natural function is to eat lactic acid and convert it into short chain fatty acids. And that in turn can promote endurance. So this is something that I'm excited to say we've de-risked, we've taken it out of the lab, we've scaled it up. We actually have working prototypes, and we'll be making some announcements soon, but that's sort of the next product in the commercial queue. So think about, you have the gut health, digestion, sleep, and now you have sort of the lactic acid metabolism and endurance. And there are also cool ways where they can interact with each other too.
Wow. So say when you identify something like that, do we know why, maybe that bug is over indexes in people who are elite ultramarathon runners? Is it because of like just the environment, the training conditions? Is it something that maybe they were more naturally predisposed to for some reason? What's happening there?
I love it. It's all form fits function and natural selection, and it's all evolution. It's all competition. So if you look at ultramarathon runners that run 100 miles at a time, they're constantly producing lactic acid in their system. And actually what we showed in our paper is, yes, it's produced in the muscles, but then when, your ability to produce it outcompetes your ability to use it, it filters into the blood. Most of it goes to the liver and gets converted to glucose. but a portion of it actually filters into the gut. And there it could serve as an energy source for Veillonella. So think about it. The more you're producing lactic acid, the more it's going into the gut, and the more Veillonella could feed and thrive off of it. So it's like this symbiotic relationship between this organism and the host.
Interesting.
And it's cool because when we did our study, we could see that Veillonella blooms in the gut of these athletes like almost immediately after intense workouts. But now think about this from an engineering standpoint. We could isolate this organism, provide it as a probiotic before exercise. So now it's in your system to help promote endurance and recovery.
Right.
So it's all, and I'll just segue to think about super strength phenotypes and looking for organisms that help with muscle development, bone development, protein metabolism, neurological applications, like literally any beneficial phenotype you could think about. We could try to identify the organisms that are driving their physiological processes.
It's so interesting because with a lot of these functions, right? I think maybe the last place a lot of people would think, at least the general public, is, oh wow, my gut is really helping me with this workout. Like, or you, to your point, like you see that person who's a professional bodybuilder, strongman, like the last thing that you would probably go to is like, what role is their gut health playing in enabling them to perform at that level? So it's kind of like a paradigm shift for me a little bit to start thinking about things in those terms. And I guess, do you at this point, now that Nella's been on the market? Well, actually, when did Nella go on the market?
Yeah, so we launched Nella around a year ago, direct to consumer.
Yes, still relatively new.
So it's still relatively new, and I would say also that's after years of R&D coming out of George's lab. So science takes time to translate, but obviously we're excited that we've created a real-world product from all that R&D. Yeah.
Yeah. What have you had an opportunity to quantify it all, like the benefits that someone could expect to see by starting to take one of these supplements? Now, I guess, the example that you laid out with the ultra marathon runners, like that's a very specific use case. Yeah. And I imagine maybe a bit easier to quantify, whereas Nella is more improved general GI function. So that might be tougher. But is there any sort of data that kind of like supports like some of these enhanced benefits people are receiving?
Yeah. So actually, before we launched Nella, we did a beta test with over 200 participants, and they consumed Nella on a daily basis for 2 weeks. It wasn't a clinical trial, but this was more of an accelerated sort of like open label study, if you will. And it was collecting user feedback in terms of surveys before, during, and after consumption of Nella. And what we found was that almost 95% of participants reported at least one functional benefit. And that was across several categories, predominantly digestion and bowel movements, energy, and quality of sleep. So, and then from there,
you've piqued my interest with sleep alone. Like I was already sold on everything else, but now I'm like, I got to try this.
Yeah, it really is, I think, an amazing time. And those are clear, and I mentioned field tested with Olympians and world champions. We could get into a second, but we went back home and we've partnered with St. John's, and we're their official probiotic, and we're also doing NIL deals with the athletes. So it's a little bit of like full circle for me.
It's amazing, but,
we're also wrapping up a clinical study with a professional soccer club in Europe. So there's a lot we're doing with Nella, also with Veillonella, but also expanding our discovery platform. We've already isolated thousands of more strains from athlete samples. So we're really scratching the surface of this new frontier of human health and performance.
Well, and I'm interested to hear, to what extent, you mentioned like world champions, Olympians, St. John's is obviously, leveraging the product. To what extent are professional sports organizations and professional athletes starting to go to this level to enhance their performance? Like, are you still breaking new ground to get people to think about the role that probiotics can play in their regimen? Or is this something that like, hey, no, some of these cutting edge teams, they're paying attention and they're trying to implement this already?
I do think education is a key component to what we're doing. And by the way, I think that's with anything. the whole point of, I think, coming out of Harvard, the Wyss Institute, and George's lab, George has a phrase that I love, and he's just like, we don't believe in science fiction, we believe in science facts. But I think a lot of, the technology we developed is very forward thinking. And I think with any avant-garde technology, education is a role, right? And I think, but we embrace that. And I think, to your point, for athletes, a lot of times it's like, well, it's electrolytes or whey protein or plant protein now. And that's what it is, or vitamins. And I think the notion of the gut and probiotics, I guess decades ago, probiotics was such a niche, Jamie Lee Curtis and kombucha or miso soup or kimchi, who eats those things? When I was at St. John's, it would always be carb loading and chicken, right?
Absolutely.
And Gatorade or whatever. So
right, yeah.
There's an education component here, but I do think that it is a community, and not just athletes. Everyone wants to be healthy. Everyone wants to be fit. And you mentioned sort of longevity. If you look at trends in the US, this is a crazy stat. 60% of the population in the US has at least one chronic condition or one chronic disease. That ranges from obesity to diabetes to neurological conditions. And what's crazy is one of the leading causes for that is lack of physical activity. Another leading cause for that is poor nutrition. And so I think we need to educate people on how lifestyles and nutritions and the microbiomes and gut health could greatly impact our health and longevity.
Yeah, it feels like we're at this very interesting inflection point where there's two diverging paths. And I think I was just talking to someone, I think her podcast comes out next week, Dr. Morgan Levine out of Yale, who just wrote a book called True Age, which is really cool. So she'd partnered with, I think there's a connection to Harvard as well, but Elysium, and she was responsible for their biological age testing, and which is just really fascinating to me as well. And she was talking about how the life expectancy in the US, I think for the first time, just started to decline. Right. So we've been on this steady progression up, but then due to some of the factors you just mentioned, actually starting to decline. And it feels like there's kind of two diverging paths. One set of people who are just so laser focused on optimizing their health. It's going to be really exciting to see what the new capabilities are, or possibilities rather, in terms of health span and longevity. And then you have a large percentage of the population who is not making correct lifestyle choices. And in fact, probably contributing to a much earlier death than is really necessary. So I just feel like, man, this is such an interesting time, and I want to be on the right side of history with this one, because there's so much potential. But yeah, for some people, it's really hard to break those lifestyle habits.
Well, I think that, first of all, this is just such an amazing conversation. I think it really hits the root of so many things that we're passionate about at Fitbiomics. But, also not to mention, that's right, 2 years of pandemic and COVID and how that's impacting, right? And even think about this, now that maybe we're starting to emerge out of COVID, how that's impacted people's lifestyles or exercise and things of that nature, mental health, ability to go out, our workforce, going back into the office, so that's impacted a lot of things. But I think what you hit on something, it's also, there's so much about accessibility and education, and just even having access to proper nutrition, right? And there's this whole trend, which I love, coming from biomedicine, I think we're so used to trying to cure or treat disease rather than preventing it and keeping people healthy. And there's this emerging trend as food is medicine or food tech. And a lot of it is applied to sustainability, in the environment, but it could also be applied to health. And there's another mantra now, it's exercise is medicine. And through nutrition and food, you keep people active and healthy. And the last thing I'll just say on this matter is, going back to accessibility, it's also affordability. And ironically, in this country, you can't have access to good nutrition unless you have to pay for it. And I think what we're trying to do is like coming out of George's lab and Harvard and all this fancy biotechnology. It doesn't mean anything unless people have access to it. Right. And for me, the key is always through athletics and pop culture and pop mediums, because if we can inspire people and educate people through athletes, we can now sort of make all this more accessible. So that's going on a tangent, but to me, that's
I love it.
Really exciting. Yeah.
Well, and you said something there too, that for me, you know, I guess two themes really, and heck, that's why I have a podcast. It's like, hey, how can we distribute information and democratize access to it, right? Because, you know, my biggest thing as an athlete too, you know, so I grew up, a lot of people already know this, but I grew up north of Seattle. So somewhere between like Seattle and the Canadian border, right? I would not argue that it's a hotbed for athletic talent in terms of like the national landscape. Not to say there's not a lot of athletes there, but I always felt growing up, and I've had some wonderful coaches and some of them listen. Yeah, shout out Judd Hunter. But I always felt like one of my limiting factors was just not access to some of the same coaching or training, right? So I was always really passionate, like, man, like if you could get the information into the hands of the kids who are really passionate and would be willing to put in the time, like what would they be capable of, rather than having it, you know, this is like kind of, I mean, the internet was around, but it wasn't like it was now. Like YouTube wasn't even a thing when I was in high school. You know, there wasn't the same capability to distribute like techniques, approaches, training methods. And, you know, so because of that, depending on maybe where you lived, who you had access to, you might have had a massive advantage. And so that's always kind of been something that was kind of like a chip on my shoulder. That's why I think podcasting is such an amazing platform, because we can have a conversation like this. Anyone can listen to it for free. But I love to hear that, like, not only are you thinking about like, hey, what is possible? It's, hey, how can we get this into the hands of as many people as possible and lower that barrier to entry?
Man, I'm getting goosebumps just hearing everything you just spoke about, because, well, one, you had a term that I think resonates. You know, you mentioned democratize, and you think about innovation and acceleration and the notion of like 20 years ago it was $3 billion to sequence a genome. Now it's $1,000. So that massive acceleration, it leads to more accessibilities, more discoveries, more opportunities. And it's how we think about this, right? We want to democratize these scientific concepts, these ideas, these modalities, the technology, and then one, to help people. I always say this too. Yeah, you know, we want to help athletes, but we also want to help next gen, you know, health. We want to help next gen scientists. We want to help next gen entrepreneurs that maybe can see what we're doing and like be inspired to sort of get into what it is. And from an athlete perspective, this is like the crazy notion of just like how opportunities and like chance or who you know affects, you know, this, right? Like you have so many athletes that are just talented, but how much of it also comes down to just opportunity or being in the right program or having the right coach, right?
Oh man.
But I think the point is, when it comes to human health and longevity, like, it shouldn't be that way. Everyone should have access to these modalities so they could live their best life, right? And like, that's part of what we're trying to do as well.
Well, and you said something else too, that it's been interesting. It's kind of been a recurring theme over the last few conversations I've had, but it's, you know, a lot of times, and again, this is, I hope I never come off this way. This is not a knock on like, you know, doctors, the medical field, profession, like, but oftentimes like what they're, I guess, maybe forced to often deal with is like the symptom, right? Like, well, we need to address this new symptom, or we need to address something that's already happened and now we need to treat it. I'm very passionate about personally in my own life, you know, how do I get to that root cause? Like, how do I focus more on like being preventative versus always responding to something that's happened? And so that's why I think something like what, you know, you're doing with Nella is so interesting. It's like, okay, you know, maybe I was initially drawn into this because it's like, oh, wow, like they're working with world-class athletes, you know, maybe there's an opportunity to improve performance. But at the same time, it's like that might open the door for me to integrate something new into my life that, you know, has a number of other benefits that just improve general health and well-being.
And again, so it's like just getting closer to that underlying root cause that often is the source maybe of some of these afflictions for people.
Wow.
And what else is really cool too, and I'll kick it to you, but just now having this conversation, and the more we learn, understanding that, your microbiome, your gut, not is it just like, something to pay attention to. Like it has an outsized impact on like the function of your entire being.
Yeah. Yeah. You just hit it on the head on so many aspects. And I mean, first of all, to your point, and I say this coming from a biomedical background, even within the biotech community, this is somewhat of a weird or different concept, because I think most biotech companies, they're used to developing therapeutics to treat disease. So the notion of using biotechnology to engineer food or consumer health or food as medicine or environmental health, like this is still, in synthetic biology, this is still somewhat of a new concept, even within, our community. So there's actually education on both sides that need to happen, right? And something that you said, it resonated, the late David Stern, and I don't know if this is the exact quote, but I love this quote. And he said, the only things that really change society are music, art, and sports. And, you think of like Gatorade and Be Like Mike, or you think about Nike and the profound ability of athletes to transcend sports and impact what we do as consumers and people. And what I like to say is like, we're acknowledging that, we're accepting that, and now we're applying it to biotechnology and human health. And
we're
so learning
cool.
It was like, let's learn, like, Be Like Mike. Okay, what's going on in Mike's biology, right?
Right.
And what now can we learn? Can we decode? Can we translate it? And now use that to help everyone be healthy.
Yeah.
Not even like Mike, just be the best versions of themselves. So yeah.
Well, and that's what's so cool, I think, about what you and your company are doing too, is you're making something like, look, admittedly, I've had a lot of different conversations on the show with a lot of really interesting people. And, normally I try and do a lot of research beforehand. But this is just something that, I just didn't know much about. And I think, if I'm someone who's very health conscious and I don't understand it that well, like then it probably, there's a large percentage of the population that would ring true for.
Yeah.
And so I think the fact that your team is helping educate, raising awareness. And as you said, like, it very well could just be like an avenue that someone gets exposed to this idea. And then who knows what offshoot comes off of that, whether it's an entrepreneurial pursuit, new research. So it's really, it's cool to be able to talk to you because you're obviously at the forefront of this. But I also love that you've taken a step back and you've said like, hey, look, like, how do ideas permeate society? It's music, it's sports, it's culture. So it's like, we got to ride that wave too. And maybe you could talk a little bit about this. You're also launching, quote unquote, at a very interesting time when you do have the opportunity to partner with student athletes, as an example. You talked about St. John's in a way that literally was not possible before. Like, what has navigating those waters been like? And has it been an enjoyable process? Has it been complicated?
Yeah, a lot of my influences were from sports and pop culture, in particular like Comic-Con and MCU and stuff like that. Actually, some of my inspirations were like LeBron James, but also like Tony Stark, just to give you sort of the expansion. So we can get into that. Yeah, but I love the idea of just like building the future in real time. And first of all, as a startup, you're always like building the plane while flying it. And that's the whole thing. You're creating almost a new frontier. And yes, that's with biotechnology, that's through next gen probiotics, that's Nella, that's Fitbiomics, but now like even NIL and like athlete empowerment and being able to partner with athletes to be more entrepreneurial and get compensated for name, image, and likeness. So, it's a fun experience. It's fun to come back home and take care of the home team, but also try to create something that is, you're amalgamating all these really cool concepts that you're at the forefront on. And what's also cool about this is it's not just like, oh, here's an endorsement deal. Like, rock a t-shirt or I don't know what it is, but actually no,
Right.
here's a product.
Give me two
help.
Instagram posts with Nella
Yeah,
in the
exactly.
background. Yeah.
Yeah. It's kind of like, here's a product that first and foremost will help you in terms of your health and performance.
Right.
And now you can sort of educate your community about that and be like a leader of the new school in this new frontier. So there's a lot we're also doing too in terms of expanding the athletes we work with. I had mentioned scaling our discovery platform. We're also building our cohort or community of superheroes. So we want to work with even more athletes across a functional spectrum, so we could continue to learn and decode microbiomes and create more next gen products for different health applications.
Well, when you gave me the example of identifying, and again, I'm in the tech field, so like I want to say over index. But, when you look at ultra marathon runners and you start to understand, hey, like what's unique about their microbiome, I just kind of had this feeling of like, oh my God, the possibilities here are endless.
Yeah.
I don't understand necessarily to what extent, like you always have something that is, of statistical significance in terms of improving performance or what have you. But it just seems like, wow, there's so many interesting avenues that you could take this within sport, beyond sport.
Yes.
Have you guys even started to look beyond sport? Like I'm even thinking, now I'm just questioning like, oh my God, like is the microbiome of someone who's like a concert level pianist different than the average person? I mean, you could be like, no, Ken, that's where we draw the line. That doesn't make any sense.
No, I think so. First and foremost, it started with looking at microbiomes in diseased populations, right?
Okay.
Now you look at sort of healthy populations. Now, athletes are just one function of healthy populations because it's very quantifiable, right? Because there's all these metrics and they gamify it. But to your point, it could be aesthetics, it could be anti-aging, it could be super centenarians, it could certainly be like, more neurological or focus applications. It could be resiliency, resistance to, there's even studies going on now with like resistance to COVID and how our microbes affect that. It could also be, to your point, creativity, the arts. Like, I actually, that's what makes this so exciting, is that it is somewhat limitless in terms of possibilities. And it's to your point, I think it's an exciting time for the field, and just in general, the whole genomics, biotech sort of industry in general. There's a lot of cool stuff going on.
Yeah. Well, and for you, I guess what is, I'm so interested in this because I do know that, like you said, I mentioned that Nella had just come out recently, and you said it was in the last year, but there was years of research behind that. And I think you founded Fitbiomics like 7+ years ago. I've always been curious, like there's this interesting relationship between study and research within like the universities, and then these really cool companies that are kind of spun out of that. So for you, like, what did that process look like? Is it something that, when you're working at the Wyss Institute, like, was Fitbiomics like incubated kind of within there, or was it once you left, you went and started it on your own? Like, how does that process work?
Yeah, so I'll be the first to admit that I was just tremendously lucky, quite frankly. Being in George's lab and being at the Wyss Institute, George's mindset and the Wyss Institute's mindset is always translation. And there's this mantra there. It's like, we do not do research to keep it in the lab. We do research so that way we could take it out into the real world and have impactful applications for human health as we know it. And so it fostered, and there was an environment that fostered entrepreneurship and the mindset of like, hey, let's not just over-engineer or do science for science sake, but like, what are we doing here and how could that turn into a viable business? So in many ways, while doing the research, there was a lot of market research as well, right? There was a lot of sort of analysis on supply chains and manufacturing. And by the way, for every microbiome company, one of the biggest bottlenecks is going from a discovery in the lab to a commercially feasible, industrial scaled food grade product, right? So there's a lot of work that goes into like, hey, let me collect a stool sample and analyze the bacteria to let me purify that and now have like a commercially viable probiotic supplement. So
right,
it's not always like that, right? It's many years of innovation. So, and then of course, to your point, then once you have a product, it's about community building, education, awareness, and optimization, and so partnerships. So that's even another level of what we're doing. So
yeah. Oh, very cool. Well, are you someone who, we've talked a little bit about like longevity and health span. Like, are you someone who meticulously is tracking, your own, like I just got the Whoop band finally. I don't know why. I was never interested. And then all of a sudden I got one of these mattresses. It's called the 8 Sleep. And I got it because it's a cooling mattress. And I'm big contributor to me waking up every night was that I'd get overheated, but my wife would be freezing. So I was like, let me get this mattress. But it came with some really cool tracking technology. And I just got hooked. And so now I'm so interested in it. Like, are you doing things outside of the work that you're doing with Fitbiomics to kind of just like improve your own health and quality of life?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me as an athlete, I've always been fairly particular or meticulous about my diet. Certainly when I was athlete, when I was in like college, I didn't really consume too much alcohol. I didn't really do too much fast food because for me, I wasn't always the most athletic person. So I had to rely on fitness and skill and like every little bit I could get. I actually think it's interesting. It's challenging now as an entrepreneur. And, even just the notion of being in grad school, getting a PhD and a postdoc and research life, and now entrepreneurship, like there's so much physical and like mental, like stress, and even like you mentioned, sleep. And I think for me, first and foremost, it's mostly about diet. I'm not particularly a quantified self person. Like I don't track heart rate or things of that nature. But in some regards, maybe I wish I had when I was an active athlete and stuff like that. I think for right now, I've kind of accepted that, entrepreneurship is just a crazy lifestyle and building the future.
You almost don't want to know.
Yeah. But to your point, maybe a la sort of an elite athlete or a Tony Stark, it's about sort of like, engineering and creating new nutrition that can sort of support the engine from inside. And that's, I guess, sort of the approach I take. Yeah.
Oh, very cool. Very cool. Well, I mean, to that point, right? I understand you're extremely busy, so I really appreciate you making the time. This has been a really fun conversation. I hope and trust people are going to take a lot away from this one. Because again, like when I initially thought probiotics, yogurt, right? Like if it was like in my lexicon, it was because like my mom said like, oh yeah, yogurt's a great source of probiotics. Forget the fact that like the yogurt I was probably eating was like packed full of sugar and artificial preservatives and all the other shit that came in it. So I think this conversation is hopefully it's been very informative for me to kind of better understand, why do they matter? What I think is really cool is to hear, like the work that your team is doing to say like, hey, look, like what can we learn from identifying, the microbiomes of elite high-end performers and like, how can we help the general population benefit from it? Like that to me is just such a cool application, especially for someone who hosts a podcast called the Professional Athlete Podcast. But I'm just like, this is just fascinating. So I really appreciate you taking the time.
Oh, this is, I think I hope you get a sense of just how animated I am. It just resonates with me. And I think it's just fascinating how, it's not about sports performance. This is about human performance.
Yeah.
I also just want to say too, like, elite athletes are benefiting from Nella and our technology, but actually most of the people are not elite athletes that are benefiting, right? And these are middle-aged folks and stuff like that, or people that are just now trying to like improve their overall health. So, it's a fascinating time. And, I say it's the beginning of the journey. And I liken this to, like, I was talking about this the other day. If you look at sort of like Star Wars or something like that, and like warp speed, and like there's that iconic scene of them going into the future. And I feel like that's where we are. And like, this is a journey, and we want everyone to be a part of this journey because there's more innovations to come through this.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and, I've
it's funny how all these conversations start to kind of like tie together. But part of the reason I started this podcast now, I mean, almost 2 years ago, which is crazy to think. I just kind of had this realization. I was like, if I had, so I played football in college and of course had aspirations to play on beyond, but didn't. And I used to have this thought like, oh man, well, if I was in the NFL, I'd be doing this, I'd be doing that. And then it dawned on me. I was like, why do I need to be in the NFL to like optimize my potential or like, be the best possible person or in the best possible health that I could be? It's like, I'd argue that my job as like a father and a husband and, a son are more important than that. So like, why am I not doing all the things to show up every day as that best possible version of myself? And I think that, kind of the mission of Nella and what you just said aligns with that. So it's like, you don't have to be an elite athlete to want to show up and give yourself the best chance to perform at, up close to hopefully your true potential. So I'm super interested. I hope people are enjoying this one. And also, so where can I point them for people who either want to know more about your company or about you personally? Where can I direct them?
Yeah, please check us out, nellaprobiotics.com. Very simple.
Excellent.
You could also check us out on Instagram. It's at Nella Probiotics. On Twitter, our handle is at Fitbiomics. That's more of the parent company to Nella Probiotics, but there's a lot of information on our website. There's a lot of articles, a lot of content, a lot of blogs, press, videos. So much there to learn. So I would certainly love everyone to check us out.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, thank you for your time, and we'll have to have you back at some point, especially as some of these next iterations come out. I'm probably going to be knocking at your door, be like, can we talk about this, please?
Exactly. We gotta get you and your community early access to these innovations.
Let's do it.
Yeah. Absolutely.
We would love that.
There's a lot of fun. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, my pleasure.